It's appropriate today that we find ourselves at the Sydney city-based offices of John Messara's Arrowfield stud. You see, John describes himself as the Pitt Street farmer made good, but life wasn't always good. He arrived on these shores as a young boy, leaving behind his parents in Egypt. I'm Anthony Mithen, and this is John Messara's Racing Life. First of all, what's life look like being Australia's most influential breeder?
Well, your influence is only as good as your last Group 1 winner, so that's a passing phase whether you are influential or not. But look, I'm a keen breeder, and I've turned what was perhaps a hobby and a passion into a business, and I look forward to going to work every day as a result. So life is good.
John, we know you immigrated to Australia at a very early age. What did life look like for a young John Messara?
Well, I came to Australia as a French-speaking young boy who had been to an English school in North Africa, in Egypt. And I quickly got more proficient at English. I went to the British Boys' School as a young man. It took a while to get used to what is an entirely different culture here in Australia. The school I went to had a lot of emphasis on sport, and lucky for me, I had a bit of size and speed about me, which helped me get on with school. And of course, like most original migrants, you get more passionate about your country than those that are born here. But I came here a very long time ago. I was sent here at the age of 11 to do my secondary education because a lot of the Messara family had already come to Australia themselves and had set up businesses here. And so I was sent by my parents to live with an uncle and aunt for the first 3 years, from 11 to 15 or 14. My parents followed after that. In retrospect, it was a very good decision that my parents made. And at the time, I didn't question it. They said you were going to go to Australia, in 6 or 12 months' time, whatever it was. And I thought it was in the future. I didn't think much about it. I wasn't even sure whether they're going or not. You're a kid, you're distracted by things. But when the day came and they took me to the airport, I must say it was a shock, and they had to sort of drag me away. I was hanging onto my mother's skirt and they had to pull me away and put me on the plane. And I remember the plane actually got to Darwin, and a seagull got into the engine, and we had to wait overnight, or maybe even 2 days, for a new engine to come in. And I was put in a motel, and I was petrified that they'll leave without me, and I'd be stuck in Darwin. But I have to say that these sort of experiences made me a lot more independent than I had been. I was a little mummy's boy at that stage, a lot more independent, and they were part of an important part of my growing up. But consider myself very lucky that that's the place I came to, and that's my home.
Must have been terribly difficult to leave the country of your birth and leave your parents behind to come to a land that you knew very little about.
Yeah, they were difficult times. I cried quite a bit at that time, I remember, particularly in the very early days. I used to write to my parents every Sunday night, and my uncle would take the letter to the office on the Monday and post it, and that was part of the deal. But when I left to come, my mother got very sick because she had 2 children, myself and my sister, and it was really tearing part of her away to send me off so far. I did go back once for a month at Christmas after 18 months. So in the space of 3 years, I only saw my parents for 1 month. My uncle and aunt, they were lovely people, and they took me in as their own son. And they had a single daughter and they couldn't have another child. So they were delighted to have me there because it meant I could play with their daughter and be like a brother to their daughter. So it worked out very well from that point of view.
And your parents' life in Australia?
Yeah, they came, and a few years later, and they loved it here, and they settled here. But they came to see me and see where they would settle, and they decided I was so well settled, and you know, it was a great country, and they stayed. So in the end, there were 4 Messara boys of my father's generation here, all doing quite well in their own businesses.
So how do you adapt? How does a young bloke who's come from another country that barely knows the language assimilate into the Australian way of life?
I wasn't very academic at school, and I spent all my time thinking about athletics and rugby. And it's only when I got to university that my father said to me, I don't think you'll be able to get through on your marks. And I said, no, I think I'll be able to get through. And I said, but you ought to make it worth my while. What if I get a Commonwealth scholarship at the end of the first year of university? Will you buy me a car? Herein lies my first mistake. I didn't describe the car. I should have said, will you buy me XYZ? I just said a car. And I fell into a big trap in that. He said, I tell you what, if you win a scholarship for the following 2 years, then the money I saved from that, sending you there, in those days you paid to go to university, he said, I'll buy you a car. Well, I decided then from the age of 17 to start studying pretty hard, and I did, and I got a Commonwealth scholarship, and so he got me a car. He got me a $300 car. I got badly done. That was the first business lesson in life. And it was a little car called the Cobra, which was a standard 10 engine enveloped in a virtually a plastic car, you know, a fiberglass car it was. But it's all I needed in those days to go to the beach and play around with my friends. So that was it. So I really threw myself into university in a big way, and I gave like everything up at that time. And I got through the commerce degree, specialising in accountancy and finance. They were my things, and that took me to the age of 20, 21, and then I launched myself into business by taking a job with an accounting firm, and then ultimately getting into stockbroking, and ultimately having my own firm in stockbroking.
Where did the interest in racing come? Because most people I know in the racing game have been bitten by the bug at an early age. What was your moment where you got the bite on the backside?
Well, my father and his brother, and one of his brothers, who had stayed back till 1961, raced horses themselves, and they used to take me to the races as a 10-year-old occasionally. And when they came to Australia, they bought 1 or 2 horses and raced them here. So I'd been involved on the racing side, but it wasn't until 1979 that I got involved in a bigger way, particularly in breeding. The only animal I knew a bit about was horses. So I decided that, yes, I'd start off by buying a broodmare and perhaps racing it for a bit longer and then going to stud with it, etc. And that's how it all started, with 1 horse.
So it seems a fascinating sort of journey. How does a Pitt Street stockbroker turn themselves into one of the most influential breeders this country's ever seen?
When I was elected, I was the youngest member ever of the Sydney Stock Exchange in those days. So I think I was 26. But before that, I was lucky enough to have a boss that decided that because I could speak French, that I might be a good young fella to send off to open their European office in Geneva. So I did have a stint of a couple of years in Geneva when I was about 23, 24, which is very young.
What an experience.
Yeah, wonderful experience. I mean, in the deep end, if you like. But I scrambled my way through that, established their office there, came back and ultimately bought the seat on the stock exchange and started into business. Bought into a small firm, ultimately took it over and did my own thing. And I used some of those statistical skills to analyse stallion progeny results and that sort of thing, and I may have been probably one of the first to do so in Australia, and that got us to acquire some of the successful stallions that we've got. Now everybody's on that game, so we've lost our advantage. But it takes the same kind of nose to find a good stallion as it does to find a good stock.
Can I take you back to that first brood mare?
Well, that mare was Scomeld, and that was the era when it was her and Capellaran, two very, very good mares. Guri studs Capellaran, Mr. Eduardo Coenco's good filly, and Scomeld won the Victorian Oaks. And at the time, it was a recommendation of Bart Cummings, who was my first trainer, that it would be a good filly to buy, and he felt that he might improve her to win a Caulfield Cup or an Epsom or something like that. And so we went off to buy her from the owner, John Needham. You might remember him. We couldn't agree on the price, and we were about 40,000 apart. And he said, "Look, I'll toss you for the difference." I said, "Mate, there's no way I'm tossing for 40,000. In the end, we settled on a middle road, and I bought the mare off him. And we raced her. She won a couple of races for us. She won the Queen of the Turf, I think it was, and she won the Theo Marks Quality. But she didn't get to greater heights than with the previous trainer. I think there might have been a trick to her that the previous trainer knew, that probably didn't tell us because we took the mare away and gave it to Bart Cummings, but there might have been an angle the way you had to train her. But Bart did his best, and we got a couple of stakes races out of her, and we then retired her to stud. She was a moderate brood mare. She produced, I think, one stakes winner, and her daughter produced a stakes winner. But she wasn't the greatest success we've ever had, but she was a very good entry into the breeding market for me, and I learnt a lot from it. Those early years are just you know, you're going to lose money but you're going to learn, and that's the price of learning.
It's perhaps an unusual entry for a first timer to go in at that sort of level. It's normally spend a little, risk a little, but you obviously had a philosophy back then that you had an eye for quality rather than any sort of quantity.
Yeah, I had a couple of advisors. We sat down, we talked about it, and we thought we'd have a small elite band of high quality mares, and that's the way we started. And then I went and bought another mare called Never Despair. It was a very good mare, grey mare, big grey mare, bold mare, and two or three others. And over time, I built a bit of a brood mare band. And of course, that led me to thinking, well, look, with those nice mares I've got, I should have a little place of my own to make sure I look after them as well as I should. And I bought into a farm called Middlebrook Park. And then once I had Middlebrook Park, I realised that having a few mares wouldn't be a very economic situation there, and I wanted to make it a business, as well as a pleasure, but a business. And so I then went looking for a stallion. And once I got a stallion, I got Rancher. It was the first stallion, the unbeaten Blue Diamond winner at the time. He won 8 in a row. I then said, well, I'd better buy some more mares to support the stallion. So one thing led to the other, and then it got to a point where it all got too big, and then I established Arrowfield. It's that type of business where one thing leads to another.
Do you have business philosophies, or are there certain ethoses that you live by in business and in breeding? Are the two areas cross over?
Well, the interesting thing about the horse business is your friends become your clients in the horse business, and your clients become your friends as well. So it's a very pleasant business to be in, the horse business, I think. But in business, you know, I'm all about relationships, long-term relationships. I'm still dealing with people I was dealing with 30 years ago. A lot of my staff have been with me for 25 and 30 years. I have a strong network of very loyal people around me, and you depend on your team. I have to say that the first several years of my involvement in breeding involved a lot of mistakes. It's only probably in the middle 80s on, where I had a few years of involvement, that I started to see the wood from the trees. It's a business that has a lot of inherent risk in it anyway, because you're dealing with animals and nature, and so there's built-in risk. So it's a business that's about mitigating that risk. And yes, stallions, particularly from the middle 80s on, for me, played a very big role in getting us to where we are today.
So who is John Messara's favourite stallion?
Well, I've got to say that, the all-time favourite has to be Dane Hill, because we went through an absolutely typical analysis of the type I was speaking to you about. It was obvious that Northern Dancer at the time was going to be the greatest sire of all sires. You couldn't afford a Northern Dancer son coming from Australia. You could only look for a son of a son. And so we went about thinking which of those sons were we going to try and zero in on for Australia. And we went through a very precise analysis of each son, and we determined that the one that ought to suit down here was Danzig, because he was an influence for speed and his progeny loved the grass. He was probably standing in the wrong country, being in America. If he'd stood in France or England, he probably would have been an even bigger success. But nevertheless, his figures were outstanding. We zeroed in on this horse, Dane Hill, because he had a great stallion's pedigree, and he was obviously a very smart sprinter. And we waited until he won his Group 1 race, and when he won the Ladbroke Sprint Cup, I contacted the racing manager of Chudmont Farms.
But here comes Dane Hill opening up, and Dane Hill takes the race with a furlong to go. Dane Hill in the lead by a length to Follyfoot. Montresor keeping on resolutely next to the rails, but Dane Hill has it as they come inside the final furlong. Dane Hill by a length and a half to Follyfoot and Montresor, and Dane Hill will win. At the post, Dane Hill the winner.
And I think they saw these Hicks from Australia approaching them thinking, hello, this is going to be a good one. And we offered more money than anybody else could think of offering for a son of Danzig, because he wasn't in vogue. He was sort of the poor cousin of the Northern Dancer line, I think. And we got to a very advanced stage of dealing in the thing. And ultimately, we bought the horse, but we did it jointly with Coolmore, because Robert Sangster, who I was friendly with in Australia and used to see him when he came out, Robert said, you must go and meet my partners in Ireland, John Magner and the Coolmore crew. I think if you got together with them, you could do something quite brilliant from a shuttling point of view, etc. And so I went over there, and I was negotiating Dane Hill, and we talked about establishing a stallion shuttle agreement between us. So if a horse came up that we thought we should shuttle, this is what we'd do. We'd buy it half each, he'd shuttle, and we set up some protocols how we would do it, etc. And when we'd agreed to all those terms, they said, well, have you got a target? And I said, yeah, I do have a target. I'm in the process of buying Dane Hill. I said, Dane Hill? Is that horse that just won the Sprint Cup the other day? But he's a Danzig. I said, yep, I know you might find it interesting. I think he'll work in Australia. Oh, if you think he'll work in Australia, okay, well, let's have a look at him. So they came along and they said, okay, we'll go halves with you after a few days. And then they got involved in the negotiations with me, and then we bought the horse. And of course the horse, I think, in my mind, is probably the best horse of the last, 50 years in terms of what he's done here and there. I mean, an incredible number of Group 1 winners, a lot of sons at stud, grandsons now at stud. I mean, he's been a wonderful stallion.
I'm glad you mentioned Dane Hill. I thought your answer might have been Redout's Choice, but given that you've brought Dane Hill up this early in the interview, can you elaborate on what is a fascinating story of how he was in your clutches and left your clutches?
There's a lesson there too. Never go into a Dutch auction with somebody that's got more money than you. I didn't figure that one out at the time. That's another lesson I've learned. But look.
There was a dispute from what I understand.
There was a dispute about the horse continuing to shuttle without a break. I think he'd shuttled, we'd agreed at the time that he'd shuttle for a limited period, 3 years, and then he'd have a break. And so we'd agreed to that. But the horse did shuttle very comfortably. He travelled well. He was a very relaxed, laid-back horse. And that's in his progeny as well. That's part of the hallmark of the Dane Hill line and of the Redout's line. They're all the same. They're great that way, and that's an advantage for them. But year 4 came along and the boys in Ireland said, well, look, we ought to continue. I mean, what's the point of stopping if the horse is handling it? And I was nervous because I thought this horse was the real deal, and I didn't want to take any chances. But I turned around to my stud manager at the time, Peter Orton. I said, what do you think, Pete? And he said, look, the horse is handling it, so maybe we can go. So we went for a 4th year, and then the 5th year came along, and we went for a 5th year. And then I said at the time, look, beyond 6 years, he's not going to go. We're going to have to, after next year, we'll give this horse a break, please. And we got to the 6th year, and they wanted to continue, and I didn't. And I said, look, I can't live with it. If something were to happen to this horse, I'd never forgive myself. I'd agreed verbally with them, and we were joint managers. John Messara and I were joint managers of the syndicate. So I couldn't live with the alternative, so I said the horse is not going, at the end of the 6th year of shuttling. And so we ended up with this cockamamie idea of having this Dutch auction. And I felt that I valued the horse a lot more than they did. And I thought, even though they have probably a lot more money than we do, little old Arrowfield at the time, they won't want to bid. And so we went into this Dutch auction, and Sir Lawrence Street, who was the Chief Justice of New South Wales, was our auctioneer in the middle. He rused the day that he didn't agree to an auction fee based on percentages because he would have collected some money. But we had this bidding duel, and
in and out of the room, I understand.
There were 2 rooms. We were each in a room, and Sir Lawrence was in a pew outside between the 2, and it was quite something. We devised every detail so that no one would be disadvantaged, and it would be held in a very pristine environment. And we had to provide, according to Sir Lawrence, financial evidence as to how much money we had available before the auction, so that he would be taking bits from somebody that couldn't deliver. And so we each provided our credentials, bank credentials, to Sir Lawrence, and I begged and borrowed as much as I could from friends, relatives, banks, anybody I could find to build up the treasury as high as it could be, and the other side obviously had an open checkbook. So and I had a feeling that at about 15 million for the value of the horse would be as far as they'd go. And they got to 15 million, and Robert Sangster, who was a shareholder in the horse, I know, decided that was enough for him to go on. That was it, he'd won out at 15. But John Magno is a very strong personality and very persuasive, and he just barreled through the 15, and they got to 23 million, and which was the limit of our money. And he bid 23.2 or something, and that was the end of it. We were out. Now, I never calculated that could happen, I have to say. And so I walked out of there, and I remember my directors of Arrowfield saying, this is a wonderful day for Arrowfield. We've got all this money for our 60, because we had about 60% equity in this horse. We had kept buying shares when they became available. We had a lot of belief in the horse. I think more belief, than, to be fair, than they had at the time. But I'll tell you the twist here. So as I'm walking back towards my office from Sir Lawrence Street's rooms, shocked, near very close to tears. That's how that's how tied I was to this horse. My director said, including Percy and Philip Esmond and the other guy said, this is a great day for Arrowfield. We're going to be cash rich. We'll be able to do this, that and the other. And I said, this is the worst day for us. I said, we're not bankers, we're breeders, and we've lost the Holy Grail. I'll never forget. That's what I said to them.
Has it strained your relationship with Cormor Stud?
It did. Look, I think I'm a guy that likes, I like to forget and put things behind me. I think otherwise you get very negative. It did for a few years. I found it hard to look at them in the face and to do any business with them. But I think as the years have gone by, I've put it behind me. Frankly, it was probably an error on my part as to how I resolved it. I should have just stood my ground and we would have found another way. Or maybe I should have acquiesced and kept shuttling, because they kept shuttling and the horse came to no harm, although he died young. So whether that was because of any strain that he had through the shuttle or not, I doubt it. So I think they were probably right and I was probably wrong, but I was being careful.
Was the greatest son of Dane Hill, Redout's Choice, the band-aid that went over the wound?
Well, the funny thing is, the first two, Dan Zero, was a great buy to start with. I remember selling him for $55,000 at the sale of the Sanctuary and buying him back a year later for $2.5 million. And I said, if I keep doing that, I'll go broke. But the fact is, he'd won the slipper, and he was then worth at least that, And I tried then very hard to sell the Dan Zero owners Flying Spur, who came through the ranks of our foals. It was a magnificent foal. And I said to them, look, you've won the slipper. Come into this one. And I couldn't persuade him to come in. He was going to fetch more money to Dan Zero. They'd got away cheap with Dan Zero. That year, I think Dane Wynn also sold for $21,000. I mean, we were giving them away in the first year. But as soon as they did something, people were going to pay for them. And I couldn't sell Flying Spur to the owners of Dan Zero, so I ended up putting a syndicate together and buying it myself with a group of people, My wife had 11% of it, and the rest, Arrowfield kept the slug of it, and the rest of it was friends and relations and all sorts of people I put into a team to buy it. I was so keen on the horse. And those two were some solace for having lost the other horse, and they turned out to be both very good stallions, and we did really well out of them. And then along came Redout's Choice, who ticked every box. +1. And people said, you've gone mad, you've got two of them. How can you have three sons of the one horse? I said, well, you can't have too much of a good thing, Imagine if on that theory I wouldn't have bought Redout's Choice.
Redout's Choice after Testarossa. Redout's Choice has grabbed the lead, 50 to go, draws away, and Redout's Choice has won the diamond.
And the big colt clear. Redout's Choice by 2 to Mastic. A gap in the race, then Flavour. But Jimmy, it was worth the big wasting here because Redout's Choice, he might be anything, and Redout's Choice takes him at Accardo.
They reached the 200 and Testarossa, sprinting very fast, has moved up and has gone to the lead over Redout's Choice. Cassidy had to pull the whip and then pins. It's Testarossa clear though. Redout's Choice is coming again. Testarossa has to find. Redout's digs. He lunges and wins. Redout's Choice beat Testarossa. A magnificent guineas.
He's a fantastic animal. This year, 20 individual stakes winners. And his lifetime stats are the best of any horse in Australia at the moment.
You're trying to write history a little with Redout's Choice, shuttling him this year to France. How's that exercise been?
I don't think I'd have shuttled that horse to anybody else in the world virtually, other than the Aga Khan. And it happened quite fortuitously when I was there speaking to Princess Zara, the Aga Khan's daughter. There was an opportunity, there was no really top horse in France, and I sort of dropped the idea, what if I was willing to shuttle Redout's? Well, of course, their jaws dropped. And then I said, well, I'd have to be satisfied that you'd support him very strongly with 15 or 20 of, really top mares. They agreed to do so, and of course they've been true to their word. They've supported the horse brilliantly. Some of the best mares you could think of have gone to him. There's an opportunity for an Australian horse, a purely Australian horse, to leave a legacy worldwide.
America is a frontier that you've looked at and had rich success through a horse like Hassanet, and now Gio Ponte and Animal Kingdom. Your ingenuity knows no boundaries.
Well, no, you've got to be very careful in America because it's, primarily dirt racing, and that doesn't really fit in so well with our purely grass racing here. And the horses have got slightly different conformation, and they don't adapt so well. Then you've got, the drug issue over there as well. In certain jurisdictions, are more lax than others. So you've got to be very careful in the modern era selecting an American horse, but that doesn't mean there aren't some great horses there. In each case where we've had a bit of a go there, the horses have ticked the boxes. Great horses come out of anywhere, and Hassanet came to me through an agent. Robin Bruss rang me one day and he said, I've got a horse with the Dane Hill stats. He knows I'm a stats freak. I said, come on, don't give me any of that. He said, I'm telling you, I've got a horse with Dane Hill type stats. And he sent me the information. He does his homework very well, Robin, and it took him a while to get me over the line because the horse was American bred but based in South America, but his numbers were just out of all creation. And I went over and got really into it and studied Chilean racing and everything else. And decided the horse was worth a go. That, I had good financial success, albeit not so good on the breeding side, with 2 horses, End Sweep and an Unbridled Song that I bought in America. Unbridled Song didn't adapt here, but I did very well. I resold him back to America and I did very well out of that. And End Sweep, unfortunately, was a joint venture with our Japanese partners, Shaddai. We did very well with him as well, although he didn't leave a legacy in Australia. There are 2 horses that we did well out of, not so much because they did well here, but because they were good horses we bought into, they did well in America. This is one of the things about shuttling. It gives you 2 shots at it. A horse mightn't work in one place, but might work in the other. So it can save your bacon that way.
And a couple of horses you're going to do exactly that with, and have started with Gio Ponti and Animal Kingdom.
Animal Kingdom, if I can focus on him, he's a terribly exciting horse. Anyway, he was another one that came through the analytical route, if you like. We zeroed in on his father, Le Roi des Animaux, and found it very difficult to acquire his father. The owners were difficult to deal with at the time. But in the process of analysing him, we got to know about Animal Kingdom, obviously, because that was his best produce. And so kept looking at Animal Kingdom over time. And then I was heading for the Breeders' Cup this year. Animal Kingdom was returning after a long layoff. He broke his pelvis. And I went at the Breeders' Cup and I watched him run in the Breeders' Cup mile. He ran an absolutely scintillating Breeders' Cup mile that broke the Santa Anita course record for the mile. And so I decided I was going to make a play for him. He was owned by a racing group, so they were bound to want to find a breeder to get involved. And then he went to Dubai. That was a prep race for the Dubai race, and he won the richest race in the world after that. He had some just wonderful performances. And he's got an interesting pedigree out of a German mare by a sire that we think a lot of. It's an unusual story, but I think that's a horse that's going to come out of left field and could be the spark to really work with Dane Hill, because his sire comes from a family that's really worked well with Dane Hill. And we're going to support him very, very strongly this year. He'll get 25 or 30 of our own mares, which is as big as we've ever gone. I mean, where in the world would you get the roster of stallions that you can get in Australia in the breeding season? Not only what we've got here, but the best of what they've got, some of the best of what they've got in Europe and America, from all over the world come here. It's a wonderful selection that we have. It's fantastic. And our sale at Easter, and even the Magic Millions, but Easter, where all the internationals turn up, is about as good as there is anywhere. The catalogue is fantastic. Anyone is beginning to turn up. We had important new buys last year. So we're up there.
Just about ready for the big one. It's set. Gates fly. They're racing in the Dubai World Cup. Royal Delta leading by 3 parts of a length. Animal Kingdom went up to be second. Coming around the turn, Royal Delta surrendered to Animal Kingdom, who darted a length and a half in front. Offside glance. Hutter's Light into the clear. Planter on the outside and an African Story, the Derby winner. Animal Kingdom in front with 200 metres left to go. Red Cadeau on the inside starting to flash home. Will he have time? Animal Kingdom leads. Animal Kingdom 3 lengths in front of Red Cadeau, and Animal Kingdom wins the Dubai World Cup in a US-Australia combination.
That was a very exciting moment as the Sheikh handed over the trophy, and you had to sort of pinch yourself to believe it was happening. It's one of those, one of those great moments that you have, dream moments.
Have you had a better day at the races?
That was a good financial day at the races. But if you ask me what my best day at the races ever was, and that came in about 1980, 81, I think it was, when I won the Oaks, the AJC Oaks, with a filly called Starzan that I'd bought out of a paddock as a foal. I went to New Zealand because there was a filly called Tartan, T-A-R-T-A-N, on offer by Taipan, and I was wanting to buy that was the time, about Scomel time, straight after that. I was collecting some quality fillies and turning them into broodmares. And I heard about this filly Tartan being on offer, and I took a vet with me, not Percy Sykes on that occasion, to New Zealand to inspect this Tartan, who'd only won a couple of trials, I think, in New Zealand. And I was walking towards her paddock with a breeder, and on the right-hand side there was a bunch of foals running around, and one foal caught my eye. I said, "What's this?" Oh, he said, "Oh, that's the Zamazan Anabolotta filly." He said, "That's a favourite." I thought, he's a spiel. He's a sales talk here from the Kiwis, they're good. We kept looking at Tartan. We found Tartan had a back problem. They were keen to sell, they wanted the money. And I said, "Look, that filly's got an issue in the back." You know, the vet ran his fingers and she really went down on her bumpers. And I said, "But if you throw that other filly in, I'm prepared to buy the two of them together. And I'll pay you what you wanted for this, and I'll pay you a sensible price for this, but I want the two of them." "No, we can't sell this." So we went and had lunch, and quietly over lunch we persuaded them, they persuaded us. We ended up buying the two together. And I thought at the time, I reckon we can win the Oaks with this filly, this little Zamazan filly, because she had a fantastic pedigree, good staying pedigree. And I'll leave her in New Zealand for another 12 months. I'll get her broken in here, and I won't be tempted to put her into training for a while. And that's exactly what we did. And then I gave her to Theo Green with one idea in mind, the back of our minds, that we'd try and win the Oaks with her. And, well, that's exactly what she did, because she had a couple of starts leading up, and then we ran her in the Princess Handicap, which is the Adrian Knox today, on the Saturday before the Oaks, on the Wednesday. And she won the Princess as an outsider. And that was a handicap. And you would never dream that she could back up and win the Oaks on a Wednesday, which is a set weight race, against, at that stage, the New Zealand Derby winner, the New Zealand Oaks winner, the Victorian Oaks winner. That was the strongest field of all time. Strongest field of all time, honestly. I remember. And here was us. We'd flummed, supposedly, this race on the Saturday on handicap conditions, you know, and here we were on the Wednesday after. You know, people said, "You're mad, you can't win at set weights, they're going to just trounce you." You've got some of the strongest fillies of all time here. Anyway, we won the race. But the beautiful thing about that one is, you know, when a plan comes off, when you've sort of taken a chance, thought about something, and it has actually come off.
It's Homemade on the outside and Starzan settling down with All In flashing to the inside. Starzan and Homemade go for the line. Starzan has beaten All In.
And I have to say that's probably the biggest thrill I've had, because it was my first Group 1 win, and it was a filly coming from nowhere, with no fanfare, and just it came off, you know, a dream came off, a plan came off.
I think, John, one thing that plenty of people admire about you is that you've got a drive to want to make this industry, or sport, should I say, Sport of Kings, a better industry or a better sport for all of those participants. You're involved in the Australian Racing Board, TVN's board, the Patent Committee, and chairman of Racing New South Wales. What drives you to be involved at that political level?
Well, in 1985, Colin Hayes had been lobbying Bob Hawke, prior to that, to bring our taxation laws in line with New Zealand. They had a far more advantageous depreciation provision for breeding stock, and it put us out of play, and virtually they'd end up with all good mares because they could write them off more quickly. And Bob did the lobbying with the Prime Minister and with others, but Colin did, and I was charged with writing the submission to Treasury. And so they quickly put me on the Blood Horse Breeders Association. They called me the treasurer for a month or two while I went there with a treasurer's hat on and went to Canberra. And I went to Canberra and made my submission to David Morgan, who ultimately was the Secretary of the Treasury and became the Chief Executive of Westpac, that David Morgan. And we laugh now about this young whippersnapper turning up and trying to, you know, bluff my way through. Anyway, the Bob had done the job at the political level, but you have to also persuade, of course, the public service, the bureaucracy. And we did this, wrote this paper, and we got taxation laws changed to be equal to New Zealand, just a level playing field, no more. And that was the beginning of the modern the evolution of the breeding industry in Australia. And I promised the Prime Minister at the time that I was building Arrowfield. I was beginning to build Arrowfield, and I said, one day I'd like you to come and open it up for us, Bob Hawke, and he did. And I said, if that happens, I'm going to buy a really important stallion and bring it to Australia, because that's what it deserves and that's what I'll be doing. And that's what led me to buy Kenmare and then Dane Hill, because we were put on a playing field where we could compete. And that was the moment where a lot of people like myself got very involved and applied quite a lot of resources to the industry. And we started rebuilding some of those farms in the Hunter Valley into really modern farms, akin to those that exist in Kentucky and Newmarket, really. Because up to that point, racing and breeding was pretty well a bit of a hobby, a sidekick for sheep farmers or cattle farmers. It really wasn't an industry unto itself as such. And that was the beginning of it. And a lot's happened here in the breeding industry, as you can see. You've now got the biggest and most influential breeders in the world, Dali and Coolmore, and the Japanese have got a stake here, and the Aga Khan sent some mares down here. It's become first-class industry, really, and a great employer, and also quite a big exporter. And I think a lot of us got together and got the place going on the breeding side of it. And ultimately I became chairman of the Federal Blood Horse Breeders Association, and we merged it with Aushorse, and we charged the industry a percentage of sales to be able to give us a chance to promote the Australian horse overseas. And now we have an international buying bench of some stature. So the job has been done on the breeding. I think the racing has to follow, and it's got a lot of natural advantages. The great franchise in Australia for racing, a lot of people have a latent interest in racing here, and we've got to try and somehow or other embrace them and bring them in. And we've got to lift the standards as much as we can. We need international style carnivals. They've got one in Victoria. We haven't got one in New South Wales. The racing now in New South Wales has a job to do. We've got to lift ourselves to the Victorian standard, which is first class. I mean, the Spring Carnival is one of the great carnivals of the world, beyond doubt. And what I'm doing now with the team that we have at Racing New South Wales is trying to emulate that in a slightly different way. Be Sydney, different culture in Sydney, different style, but nevertheless have just as important a carnival here in the autumn. We don't want to compete with a spring because we don't want to do anything to harm the Victorian spring. It's an asset for the whole of Australia.
Is it time, do you think, for the unification of the Australian racing and breeding industry and a federal minister to perhaps be appointed?
There's never been more cooperation. And I think that started from an association I had with Michael Duffy. I've got enormous respect for that man. He's a true racing enthusiast. The first man I went to see when I became chairman of Racing New South Wales was I flew over to Victoria and paid a visit to Michael and said, Michael, this is a chance for the two states to work together. Can we discuss some of the matters of mutual interest? And I laid out a few of them, and he laid out a few of them, and funnily enough, we agreed about a lot of things. Not everything, but we agreed about a lot of things, and we agreed we'd work together to achieve some of those, and we have, and we are still. And of course, since then, Rob Rolston's taken over, and I've had a relationship with him over the years, and we work very well together. And so I can see New South Wales and Victoria working closely together. It might never get to a formal national body, but there's a lot of consultation and a lot of work and a lot of mutual respect that exists now between the various jurisdictions.
Personally, John, it seems that life couldn't be any happier for you at the moment. You've got a beautiful wife, Christine, 4 very successful children in their own right, now grandkids. But could have been a very, very different story, as I understand it, if you'd not been brave enough to go on a blind date, a double blind date, I think it might have been, all those years ago.
Yeah, well, that's a funny story too. I'd come back from Switzerland when I'd opened that European office and worked there for a year, and I'd come back and I'd lost contact with a few of the friends and what have you, and I ran into one of my mates, and he said, I'll organise a blind date for you with the number 2 in Miss Universe. I said, what? So he said, that's what I'm doing for you. We'll go out on a nice date. Where do you want to go? I said, well, actually, there's a play on at North Sydney. We should go to this play. We can have a bit of dinner afterwards, etc. So
With
the
runner-up,
Miss Universe, please. He had some other girl that lived in a friend of his and a girlfriend of his lived in the same flat as this runner-up in Miss Universe. As it turns out, I turn up there and the number 2 in Miss Universe is not available because some boyfriend from Melbourne had turned up and she was more interested in the one she knew than the one she didn't know. And there's only one other girl in the flat, and this was this secretary girl that used to be a secretary in town and had the little alcove. She could only afford to rent the little alcove from this group of girls because she was on a pretty low wage. And that was my wife, Christine. But nobody told me that she wasn't the number 2 in Miss Universe. So I fell in love with the concept of being, you know, the number 2 in Miss Universe, set up with the number. So up comes Christine. I don't know that she's not number 2 in Miss Universe. As far as I'm concerned, she was. And that gave her a pretty good start. But anyway, the funny thing is we hit it off enormously well. I saw her every day for 6 weeks. I got engaged at the end of 6 weeks. I got married 3 months later, 3 or 4 months later. And that was 41 years ago.
Love at first sight on false pretenses.
Yeah, on false pretenses, there you go.
And 4 children who you must be very proud of.
Our eldest, our first child, is a doctor. She's based at the Orange Base Hospital and she's doing very well there. Paul, the next child, is a trainer who trained 51 winners last season and he's doing well. He's the only one in the business at the moment. The next son is Michael, who's a successful fund manager. He's a financial guy, came through the same route as me. I don't know that he's going to spill off into breeding like I did. I think he'll stay with what he's doing. But he loves the horses and he's a good, in America they call him a good handicapper because he's very good on form.
Likes a bet.
Yeah, likes a bet. And then our daughter Susie is the morning show, Channel 9's morning show correspondent in Hollywood, in LA. So she lives in LA and reports on the goings and in the movie in Hollywood. So they're all in absolutely, totally divergent walks of life, those kids. But there you go.
Have they changed your life much?
Yeah, entirely. And of course, they say about grandchildren changing your life, and you don't believe it until it happens. And it is an entirely different feeling to having your own children, and it's a complete. It's a fantastic thing, and it might sound corny, but it is.
Now, a quirky one for you, John. The racing gods are smiling upon you on this very day, and they've decided that you can own one of 2 racehorses from the start of their career. And this racing god is particularly happy with you because he's given you the choice between Black Caviar or Makybe Diva. Who do you choose?
No, I'd have to take the Caviar.
You would?
Yes, I think I'd have to take the Caviar. Makybe Diva, by the way, spent the first 18 months of her life at Arrowfield. We did the early rearing of her. She has our brand on her. Yeah, but, and she's a great mare, and what an exciting thing to win those Melbourne Cups. You know, you dream as a kid of winning those Melbourne Cups, but Black Caviar is something very special. I don't think we'll see another one like it for quite some time.
I've got a funny feeling we won't see another John Messara for a long time. Thank you for spending time with us. We've appreciated it and look forward to catching you again soon.
Pleasure.
Thanks, John.
Cheers.